All right, good morning. Talking about AMSCO Chapter 8 for AP US History. Chapter 8 goes from 1815 to 1848. Some of the key concepts that we'll look at just to kind of show you how I've set up my notes so you can have a sense of where we're headed. The era of good feelings, presidency of James Monroe and Henry Clay's American system. So this brief period of stability and tranquility in the US, followed by the Panic of 1819. We'll talk about the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which will become incredibly important as we move towards the Civil War over the next few chapters. And then we'll talk about both foreign policy with the Monroe Doctrine, where the US basically claimed Latin America as theirs, essentially. And then some of the economic changes, transportation revolution and market revolution. So this chapter is in AMSCO, it's called Nationalism and Economic Development. So we'll talk about the economic development quite a bit at the end and also during the American system. And then we'll talk about the nationalism during especially the Missouri Compromise and Monroe Doctrine. So James Monroe fought from 1817 to 1825. And this, his presidency, or at least the first half of it, is sometimes nicknamed the era of good feelings because there was only one political party with any power, the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, you might remember, they had John Adams, they had Hamilton. But after John Adams' presidency, by the time Jefferson takes over in 1801, I think, the Democratic Republicans are basically going to rule unopposed for the next a few decades. And so James Monroe is kind of most characterized by, I guess, a westward migration. We see a lot of westward migration during his presidency into the land acquired by the Louisiana Purchase. And then just generally spirit of nationalism, optimism, and goodwill. Now, again, that is for the white Americans, especially for the white property owners. But yeah, so the era of good feelings. So this was basically one party rule. This is the Democratic Republicans, and there's generally increased nationalism, optimism, things like that. For James Monroe, he's especially interested in westward migration. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to say who's an important president or not, but I am going to move on. One of the most important things that James Monroe did during his presidency was actually created by a congressman, Henry Clay, sometimes nicknamed the Great Compromiser, because he'll have a hand in the Missouri Compromise a few years later. Henry Clay creates something that's nicknamed the American system. This is basically an attempt to create an American system of trade, of markets, of economics. And there were a handful of things that he did. First, he created a protective tariff that put a tax on goods from other countries. Therefore, European goods are more expensive. Therefore, you're more likely to buy American-made goods. That helps promote domestic industries. He also creates or helps to create a second national bank. The first one had expired a few years earlier because the Democratic Republicans were opposed to it, because remember, they want a strong central government. And then he generally helps to promote a system of roads and canals and transportation networks to encourage trade between the different regions of America. Now it says at the bottom that no federal funds were allocated for this. This was actually done by state governments, which is an interesting way to strengthen the country as a whole, but without a strong central government. So perhaps the Democratic Republicans were more on board with that. So the American system, I'll put the examples first. So there is a tariff of 1816 on imports. There's also a second national bank, which offers loans and credit to new businesses. And then improved roads, canals, which leads to better trade. All of this basically encourages trade between all of the different regions. Whatever. You're getting mostly raw goods from the South and also the West as we get expansion there. And then the manufacturing centers are mostly in the North, New England, and the East, the middle colonies. So let me actually clarify this. Encourages trade between regions. So you have raw goods from the South and the West, and they go to the manufacturing centers in the North and the East. So Henry Clay's American system allows the American economy to grow and to boom and to prosper by allowing each region to kind of play their own part, which may or may not cause some troubles later on down the road. Now, this era of good feelings is very short-lived, only a few years before the Panic of 1819 hits, and all of that goodwill and economic prosperity starts to struggle. This was the first economic crisis since the Constitution's ratification. So the first real economic crisis that the United States of America has had to face. And so the Second National Bank tightens credit to control inflation, which means they're not going to offer as many loans to people to try to keep prices down. But states are really going to suffer from this because states aren't able to get as much credit to loan to people. So state banks close, that leads to unemployment, that leads to people losing their businesses, massive debt for individual people. And the Panic of 1819 was especially bad in the West due to rampant speculation. People basically buying stuff with money that they don't have, that they borrowed. And when the day comes for them to pay up, they don't have the money, they can't take out another loan. You can imagine the crisis there. So Panic of 1819, it kind of ends the era of good feelings, I suppose. It is the first economic crisis of the US, and it especially hurts the West and kind of smaller merchants, farmers, business owners, things like that. Okay, so again, moving on actually to our next topic, which will be westward migration. Presidency of James Monroe, you have both economic height, economic strength, the American system that's going to allow America to industrialize eventually and really prosper as an economy. But then we also have this economic crisis. So highs and lows under James Monroe's presidency. James Monroe, though, was also known for westward migration. You might remember the Louisiana Purchase had been made a decade or so before James Monroe's presidency. And so now there's all of this land that the US, quote unquote, owns that they are going to begin to expand towards. Now, there were a lot of motivations for spreading west. Part of it was to get land from the Native Americans, William Henry Harrison in the West and Andrew Jackson in the South. We'll talk a lot about Andrew Jackson's Native American policies in a later chapter. He was really a horrible human being. So one is to get land from the Native Americans to get rid of a potential threat from the Americans' perspective. There was also some economic incentives to spread west. People in New England were sometimes starting to struggle economically with increased competition, I suppose. And so a lot of people in New England, a lot of merchants and business owners, they want to spread west. They want fresh land, fresh start, if you will. There's also improved transportation. Remember, because of Henry Clay's American system, there's roads and waterways and canals and whatnot. And so that allows for transportation. You can get there, but you can also send your goods back. It's a chance to make money. And then for immigrants who are just coming to the US, this was relatively cheap land. And so it was a chance for them to get a plot of land for relatively cheap and kind of start a new life, I suppose. And so I'm actually going to add westward migration just above the Missouri Compromise because they're related. So there's increased migration to the west in the early 1800s, again after the Louisiana Purchase. Some different motivations here. One is to eliminate the Native American, I'm going to put threat in quotation marks because that was how it was perceived by people like William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson. There was a need for fresh land to farm. There was also improved transportation and trade. And then there's cheap land, especially for immigrants. Now, the big problem that you can see down here is, okay, as the US expands, will this new territory allow slavery? Right now, slavery was only allowed in the southern colonies, sorry, not colonies, southern states, not in the northern states. And so one of the biggest like key terms that you have to know from the first half of this course really is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Once we get to the Civil War in a month or so, we're going to look back at the Missouri Compromise. We're going to say, well, wait a second. The Missouri Compromise almost laid the seeds, started to have a long-term cause of the Civil War. So this will become important later on. Missouri Compromise, also created by Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the guy who created the American system. And it was designed, the goal of the Missouri Compromise was to keep a balance between slave states and free states. I should add that here. The goal here is to have a balance between free and slave-owning states. Basically, they're kicking the can down the road. They're not trying to solve the slavery dilemma. They're just trying to keep a balance for now. There was a proposal called the Topulation Amendment, which would allow Missouri to be added as a slave state. But it did say that any future enslaved Africans born into slavery, they'd be freed at age 25. So the Topulation Amendment was trying to, short-term, make Missouri a slave state, but long-term lay the groundwork for emancipation, for freedom. Southerners kind of saw through that and opposed it. And so the Missouri Compromise really did three things. It said Missouri is a slave state, but it also added Maine as a free state, so you still have the balance between free and slave states. But it said any states above the 3630 line or the 3630 parallel, which we'll see in a map, slavery is not allowed. So again, the Missouri Compromise says three things. It says Missouri is added as a slave state. It says Maine is added as a free state. This is, again, to keep the balance. But it says no slavery in any new states above the 3630 line or in the land acquired from the Louisiana Purchase. And so this map shows it to us here. You can see the 3630 line is right here, just on the southern border of Missouri. And so all of this land up here must be free. And we'll see this map again, I think, in a second. So again, Missouri Compromise, we're just going to kind of almost pause that for a second. We're going to come back to that idea quite a bit later, so it'll become more relevant later on. Okay, again, jumping around a lot today. Some other key details from Monroe's presidency with foreign policy. There are some conflicts with some pirates called the Barbary Pirates. There's also conflicts with Canada. Remember, after the War of 1812, the Americans basically had to accept that the British Canadians would stay up in the north. In terms of negotiations with Canada, there's something called the Rush-Bagot Agreement that was trying to limit conflict in the Great Lakes, or limit conflict between America and Canada to make conflict less likely. They also, the US and Canada also decided they would have shared fishing rights off of Newfoundland. Again, this cooperation between neighbors to try to avoid conflict. And then they were also able to settle who owned what along this land over here. And they decided joint occupation of Oregon, the Oregon Territory, and then settling where the border would be. And you can kind of, if you squint, see that there's that line right there where the border would be. And so what we're basically seeing, I'm going to put this in other changes because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. There's cooperation with Canada during this time period. There is limited fortifications, and so like they're not building forts or defenses. Fortifications. There is shared fishing rights, and then there are borders that are agreed upon. So in terms of foreign policy with Canada, decent relationships with them as they're starting to negotiate who controls what. Now with Florida, which was controlled by the Spanish at this point, quite a bit more conflict with the Florida. Now there had been a lot of conflict with Florida during the War of 1812. Oftentimes runaway slaves would run to Spanish Florida because they could get their freedom there. And so the US and Spain, or the US and Spanish Florida, had kind of a testy relationship because, again, lots of runaway slaves would flee the South to Spanish Florida to try to win their independence. And so General Andrew Jackson, who will become our president in the 1920s, I can't remember if that's whatever, soon, he sends a militia down to Florida. He destroys these Seminole or Native American villages and basically just crushes any of the governments and civilizations there that were trying to help these runaway slaves. And the US basically forces Spain to give us Florida. Now, we paid $5 million for this, but really, Andrew Jackson and the US forces Spain to give us Florida. Something like that. So Jackson and the US attack Spanish Florida and they gain it by force. So again, seeing some different relationships with our neighbors to the north versus our neighbors to the south. The big foreign policy change is what's known as the Monroe Doctrine, though, named after, obviously, President James Monroe. Basically, after the fall of Napoleon in Europe in 1815, monarchs retake power throughout Europe after the French Revolution had failed. And there starts to be an increased wave of imperialism as the European countries gain more power after 25 years of war and revolution, and they want to use that power to gain colonies again. And so Russia starts to go towards Alaska, starts to go towards Canada, even starts to go towards California, which threatens the US. Ultimately, James Monroe settles on what is known as the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine basically says Europe cannot colonize in the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and Europe cannot intervene or interfere in the Americas. Basically, well, hold on, let me add this first. So Europe cannot colonize or intervene in the Americas, specifically the Western Hemisphere, but it's essentially the Americas. What this is basically the US saying is that the US is basically saying, we control the Americas. They're ours. We will do with them what we want, either through force or through trade. And so the Monroe Doctrine, you can kind of see in this political cartoon, James Monroe, he puts his hat down in South America, claiming it for himself. Meanwhile, the European monarchs can only look on in envy at the land that they're not able to conquer, I suppose. To add on a little bit more on the Monroe Doctrine, yeah, so James Monroe announces that Europe will no longer colonize the Americas, will no longer intervene in any American affairs. And the goal of this was to keep Europeans out, and allow us to defend ourselves and defend our land, quote unquote, our land, because they're extending that to the Americas. This was a huge symbol of patriotism for the Americans because, like, they're standing up for themselves against the big bad Europeans and they're showing how strong they are. But the Europeans were just like, well, like, who the heck do they think they are to tell us to do this? The Europeans saw it as arrogant and pompous and conceited. But they did stay out of the Americas because largely it would have been very expensive to go all the way over there, and then they knew that there would be a war. So this inspires patriotism in the US. And this is something that's called the illusion of isolationism, because the US is almost saying like, okay, we'll stay out of your issues if you stay out of ours. So it seems to imply the US would be isolated, would not involve themselves in European affairs. But now, because they quote unquote control the Western Hemisphere, the US is going to get involved in all sorts of conflicts with their with their Latin American neighbors. So the US will not get involved in European affairs, but will have lots of conflicts in Latin America because they said it was quote unquote theirs. So the Monroe Doctrine is really going to set a precedent for the next 100 years, really until World War I, 1914 or 1917, when the US joins, where the US is going to say, we'll stay out of Europe's affairs if you stay out of ours. America is going to create an American empire in the Americas, both a physical empire and an economic empire through trade. Okay, some other details that we're seeing during this time period of James Monroe and others. John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You might remember Marbury v. Madison a little bit earlier, where the Supreme Court gained the power of judicial review to rule laws as constitutional or not. And over the next, over the 18 teens and 1820s, the Supreme Court had several other key rulings that generally strengthened the power of the federal government. McCulloch v. Maryland said that the Bank of the U.S. is constitutional, that the federal government can make that power. Gibbons v. Ogden also said that only Congress can control interstate commerce, not the state. So now the federal government has the power to create banks, and they have the power to regulate commerce. And then the Supreme Court decided, well, let's give ourselves some more power too. Cohen's v. Virginia said the Supreme Court can review state court decisions on federal laws. So that allows the Supreme Court to have some powers to rule over other court decisions. So we got foreign policy there. With the Supreme Court, we have some decisions that strengthen the federal government powers, McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden. And then they also strengthen the power of the Supreme Court to rule on certain decisions. And all of this is based off of a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which basically said that, okay, the Constitution doesn't list every single power that the government has, but there are some implied powers in there. Because the Constitution says that they can regulate commerce, well, they can make a bank. They can regulate interstate commerce, etc. Some other trends that we're seeing is population growth, massive population growth in the Americas. Most of that is caused by westward expansion. Now, let me just show this here real quick. This shows us a graph of population growth. And you'll see here that the US population doubles every 25 years. So if you go from 1800 to 1830, more than doubles. To 1860, it almost triples. To 1890, it doubles. And you can see that growth is in every single region, in the Northeast, in the South, which now has more than the Northeast, to the Midwest, now has more than any other else, and in the West as well. And this population growth is largely because of a lot of immigration, mostly from Europe, and because of a high birth rate of people basically surviving and having large families and whatnot. So by 1860, the US was the fourth biggest country in the world. There's 43 relatively large American cities of 20,000 plus. But this has huge effects that's sometimes called ecological imperialism or environmental imperialism. As they expanded west, they destroyed the land. first by growing tobacco there, which ate up all the nutrients, and then just abandoning the land. As they went west, they also slaughtered beavers and bisons and buffalo as well for food, which led them to nearly go extinct. Native Americans obviously had completely relied on the land to survive, and so that's going to have huge effects on native populations as well. Famous photograph of some explorers standing on the skulls of bison, I believe. And so there will eventually be some efforts to conserve land, national parks and whatnot, but that will take a little bit of time to get going. So we have population growth. Immigration plus high birth rate leads to huge population growth. And then we have with westward expansion, that leads to, I don't know, the destruction of the land, of the livestock, things like that. Okay, the last thing that we are getting to is the transportation revolution and market revolution in the America. Now, 1800s, this is during the Industrial Revolution in England. While England is industrializing, the US doesn't, at least not at first. Partially because land was so cheap and plentiful in the America that there was an incentive to focus on agriculture. There also weren't enough workers, especially in the urban centers, and there's not enough money. Not only that, but the British were doing quite well. The British kind of had Europe on lock, and so America wasn't really able to compete with the British. The US will eventually industrialize, and when they do, they'll become tops in the world, but it took quite a bit longer in the US. But as they did start to industrialize in the 1800s, two main terms or concepts that we need to be familiar with: the transportation revolution and the market revolution. The transportation revolution is taking what Henry Clay did with the American system and just building off of that. You got more roads, railroads, steamboats, canals that are allowing the transportation of raw materials from the south and west up to the north, and then manufactured goods up from the north down to the south and the west. So transportation revolution, let's see, we have new roads, railroads, steamboats, and canals. I'm going to put the Erie Canal up here. And this allows for raw materials from the south to the north, and then manufactured goods from the north to the south. All of this leads to massive increased trade. So you can see the creation of the road here. Wasn't asphalt or concrete just yet. Steamboats here. This is the National Road or the Cumberland Road from West Virginia to Illinois. Allows for trade across the Midwest. You see the railroad here as well. You can see that it was mostly in New England, sorry, the Middle Colonies, my bad, and the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois, New York, etc., with some systems in the South to get the natural resources up to the manufacturing centers, and then one road out to the West eventually. But again, most of the manufacturing centers are in the Midwest and in the North. The South, their job is just to send the natural resources up. They get manufactured up here and then sold back down to the South and to the West. Alongside the transportation revolution is also the market revolution. And this was basically driven by the North. They wanted to trade with the West. They wanted to make as much profits as possible. And so this led to a division of labor. Each region does their own thing. The South grows cotton. The West focuses on grain and livestock because they got all this land. And the East, they focused on manufacturing. This shifts the economic center to New York and to the Northeast because that is where all of the trade and whatnot is happening. So there's a division of labor. South focuses on cotton, the West focuses on livestock, and the North or Northeast focuses on manufacturing. Again, all of this leads to huge economic growth. And the goal, and I should actually add, that this is a market-oriented economy, meaning the goal is to make profit. Before this, most people were subsistence agriculturers. They would grow what they needed to survive. Now the goal is to make money. So huge economic growth. There is a national, I should actually add that there's like now national trade. It's not regional. You're not just trading with your region, you're trading with your entire nation. All sorts of inventions accompanied and allowed this to happen, such as the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which allows them to produce cotton much quicker, or allows them to turn cotton into thread. Businesses start to create a new system of stocks, basically like the joint stock company, where they could private people could buy a share of a business and profit from that. The factory system split up the division of labor. We'll explore all of this a lot more a little bit later on. Last couple of slides here. Now the problem, as you have all of these factories popping up, especially in the Northeast, is the labor problem. You need people to work in these factories. And so what we basically see here is that, okay, so this is called the Lowell system. We basically see that children and women are, I'm gonna say pressured, not forced, but are pressured to work in the factories. Not surprisingly, the working conditions were pretty dreadful. We'll explore this in a lot more detail later on. And so to fight against these poor working conditions, we have the creation of labor unions to fight for better pay, shorter hours, safer conditions, things like that. Whoops, that was not on purpose. Now these unions will face some challenges. Largely, there's a lot of immigrants that can just come in and replace them. So how much power do they have? Some states outlawed unions. And then just lots of like frequent little panics and frequent economic downturns that would make their lives challenging. But we begin to see the emergence of labor unions beginning to fight for more rights for workers. Okay, last two slides. Along with this massive industrialization, especially in the North, the South begins to industrialize as well. Especially with the cotton gin, what we see is commercial agriculture. Basically, the South is not just growing their crops to sustain themselves, but they're growing crops to make a lot of money. And so you can see the spread of slave populations throughout the South, which will obviously lead to conflicts with the Civil War. As the slave population spreads, because they're working the land, that's going to lead to increased productivity as well. So I'll just add that as a detail. South begins to industrialize too, with the spread of slavery in the South. Key points to focus on here, if you want to pause this screen and make sure you have these key terms. The era of good feelings, the American system, which connects with the market rev and transportation rev, the Missouri Compromise, connected to westward migration and the effects there, and then the Monroe Doctrine. So like normal, I will switch over to our notes here if you need to pause. We've got the era of good feelings, American system, westward migration, Missouri Compromise. We've got the Monroe Doctrine, transportation revolution, market revolution, and then just some other changes at the bottom. Make sure you pause there if you need to get those notes, and have a great day.